Have you ever noticed that sometimes seemingly random things cause you to react in particular and maybe peculiar ways? Maybe you have a coworker that walks by on their way to get their routine third cup of coffee for the day and suddenly you feel hungry. Or a certain song comes on the radio and out of nowhere you get the urge to go to the mall. How can these mundane things trigger completely unrelated responses? The answer? Conditioning. Conditioning happens all the time in life, whether we realize it or not. Our awareness of conditioning and how it happens stems largely from a study done by a man named Ivan Pavlov. So grab a drink and a snack, get comfortable, and get ready to find out why you are way easier to train than you think you are. On Your Mind On, Pavlov's Dogs and Classical Conditioning. Back everyone, and welcome new listeners. I'm John Shaw, and this is the second episode of Your Mind On, a podcast where I satisfy my own curiosities about psychology and share what I've learned with you all. Last week's episode was pretty heavy and might have been a bit hard to get through. I know it was for me. But I hope that it served you in some capacity, whether that is dealing with your own grief and struggles in life right now, or helped you understand what someone close to you is going through. This week we have a much more light-hearted but equally interesting topic. Before we jump in, just a few administrative notes. First, I apologize for the audio quality in the last episode. I know that it wasn't the greatest. Since I'm just starting out in the land of podcasting, I didn't have the greatest recording equipment yet, but it worked for the first episode. I have a new microphone this week, and hopefully the audio quality is considerably better. Also, the last episode was a difficult one for me, so I appreciate you bearing with me as I stumbled over words at times and had several pauses that were probably longer than they should have been. Despite many takes in those sections, I just couldn't stop the emotions from trying to slip in, which inevitably caused me to pause. Second, I mentioned at the end of the last episode, I am not a licensed mental health professional. While I can research and present topics, and I can listen if you need to talk, I'm not licensed or qualified to provide any kind of diagnosis or treatment. You can always reach out via the podcast email, hello@yourmindonpodcast.com, which is also listed in the show notes. But if you are really and truly struggling, speaking with a licensed professional is critical. Now that we have that out of the way, on to the show. Pavlovian conditioning. Maybe you've never heard of it before. Maybe you've heard jokes about it. Maybe you've heard stories, descriptions, or anecdotes, but what is it really? Also known as classical conditioning, Pavlovian conditioning is defined as a type of associative learning where a neutral stimulus becomes associated with a biologically potent stimulus, eventually eliciting a conditioned response. As defined by Wikipedia, it is a behavioral procedure in which a biologically potent stimulus is paired with a neutral stimulus. The term classical conditioning refers to the process of an automatic conditioned response that is paired with a specific stimulus. Okay, so that was kind of a lot of jargon there, and some of you are probably already experiencing your eyes glazing over. Hang on, don't shut the podcast off yet. To simplify, classical conditioning is when something triggers a response when it shouldn't because it shouldn't be related. One of the earliest psychologists to make a major impact was Ivan Petrovich Pavlov, a Russian-born psychologist. Born in 1849, Pavlov was the oldest of 10 children. His father was a Russian Orthodox priest, and his mother was a homemaker. By all accounts, Pavlov had a fairly normal childhood, doing all the things that young Russian children liked to do at that time. Although he could read by the age of 7, he did not start a formal education until the age of 11 due to an injury he suffered when he fell off of a stone wall onto a stone-paved area. After that, he began a religious school and went on to seminary with the aspirations of becoming a priest like his father. However, he gained some inspiration by the father of Russian psychology, Ivan Sechenov. In 1870, he enrolled in the University of St. Petersburg to study natural sciences. But this is starting to delve too much into history that, well, frankly, doesn't have that much to do with Pavlov's actual experiment and findings. So we'll shorten this here by saying Pavlov spent a lot of time in school. He was super smart and was nominated for the Nobel Prize 4 times, winning on his 4th nomination. Like I said, the guy was smart. One of his most notable studies was classical conditioning. So notable, in fact, that it's often referred to as Pavlovian conditioning. But the interesting part here is that his study was actually a byproduct of a different study that he was conducting. Remember how I mentioned that Pavlov had won the Nobel Prize? Yeah, well, that wasn't for psychology, but rather for a study he did on the digestive system of dogs. It was during this study that he noticed what he called psychic secretions. Basically, he noticed that when he would ring the bell that alerted the dogs to dinner time, they would begin salivating before the food was even present. They would also salivate if they heard the footsteps of his research assistant, who typically only interacted with the dogs as far as feeding them. Out of curiosity, he set out to reproduce this phenomenon and had tremendous success. Pavlov proved that when we associate one thing with another, we begin to react to the first thing the way we would react to the second thing, even if it doesn't make sense otherwise. What dog salivates at the sound of a bell? The ringing of a bell should not make a dog's or a person's mouth water. But good food? Now that'll make your mouth water. Just imagine sitting down at your favorite restaurant and the serving staff setting a plate of your favorite food in front of you. Now, what if that serving staff had a ritual of shouting something completely unrelated before putting your food down? Maybe they yell the word purple and then set your food down. After several visits to the restaurant, the waitstaff shouting purple, then giving you your food, you start to notice that if anyone anywhere shouts the word purple, you start to crave your favorite dish. You, my friend, have been conditioned. This experiment led to identifying several key points that are still used in virtually every psychological experiment today. The first is the unconditioned stimulus. An unconditioned stimulus is anything that produces a natural reaction. Any reaction we have naturally is produced by an unconditioned stimulus. A bright light is an unconditioned stimulus. We have a normal, natural reaction. Next is the unconditioned response. Going hand in hand with the unconditioned stimulus, this is our reaction. That bright light, we squint, shield our eyes, or even put on sunglasses. Around a sound that's too loud, we find a way to cover our ears or use earplugs. These are unconditioned responses, our natural reaction to the world around us. Next, we have a neutral stimulus. A neutral stimulus is something that we encounter that has no effect on us whatsoever. We have no response to this kind of stimulus because it's completely out of pocket and has nothing to do with anything. Yet. Basically, it's like seeing an elm tree while you're driving. In all likelihood, you probably wouldn't even notice the tree, except maybe that it's casting a shadow or the leaves show up bright in the sun. And now we have the conditioned stimulus. Under normal circumstances, the conditioned stimulus has no impact on us. But when it's paired with an unconditioned stimulus, it can begin to elicit a specific response for us. I'll give an example to try to explain how all this goes together later on. Then, finally, we have the conditioned response. This is the crucial outcome of the whole thing. This is the response that under normal circumstances doesn't make sense, but when paired with a conditioned stimulus, it causes a specific condition within us. So how does this all go together? Often it's hard for me to understand things like this without a good example, so I'll try to give you one here. When we see a branch fall out of a tree while we're driving, the branch is an unconditioned stimulus. It's something that causes a natural response within us that causes us to swerve out of the way. This swerving out of the way is the unconditioned response. We see a dangerous situation and we react to it. Now, if we see a cat sitting under that tree, in most cases it's not going to produce a reaction in us aside from the usual, "Oh look, it's a cat." This would be a neutral stimulus. The cat is just there. It has no bearing on us, the tree, or our safety. But what if you see a cat sitting under a tree and just before you get there, a branch falls out of that tree? Maybe you wouldn't have noticed the branch in time without seeing the cat first. And then the next day as you drive past the same tree, you see the cat again. And again, a branch falls out of the tree. This goes on every day for weeks. You see the tree, you see the cat, a branch falls out of the tree, and you swerve. On the days that you don't see the cat, no branch falls out of the tree. Then, after some amount of time, you're driving along and you see the tree. Then you see the cat. And suddenly, without thinking, you change lanes. Now, you don't have to swerve for a branch that falls out of the tree. So every day that you're driving and you see the cat sitting under the tree, you change lanes to avoid a branch that is inevitably going to fall. And one day after changing lanes when you see the cat, no branch falls. From that day on, no more branches fall from the tree. But still, every time you see a cat sitting under that particular tree, you change lanes immediately. The cat has now gone from being a neutral stimulus to a conditioned stimulus, and changing lanes has become a conditioned response. So why is classical conditioning worth learning about? Classical conditioning is something that we can see every day in life. It's something we experience constantly without even realizing it. Think of a toddler. They have reached the age where they can communicate with us using simple vocabulary, but when they get hungry, they might scream and cry rather than telling us the word hungry. Why is that? Well, it's because they've kind of conditioned themselves to do so. It starts with hunger pains in a baby. The hunger hurts, so they cry. And in response, they get food. As they get older, they begin to realize that they don't have to wait for the pain. If they get hungry, they can cry and someone will give them food. In the mind of a baby or a toddler, crying means food. Just like in the dog's mind, a ringing bell meant food. But classical conditioning doesn't end there. If you really stop and examine your own behavior, I'm sure you'll find all kinds of weird quirks that you have. For me, every time I do yard work, I crave chicken nuggets. Now, what the hell does yard work have to do with chicken nuggets? For most people, absolutely nothing. But when I examine my own life, the answer doesn't take long to find. As a kid, my dad worked in the next state over during the week and was home only on the weekends. So most of the time, it was just me and my mom. In the spring and summer, when school wasn't in particularly, that meant the yard work fell to me to get done. And as a reward, after spending the whole morning cutting grass, trimming weeds, and everything else that needed done, my mom would buy lunch at McDonald's. And at the time, my preference was chicken nuggets. It never failed. If I spent the morning working in the yard, I would get chicken nuggets. Now, fast forward about 30 years. I own my own house, and of course, that comes with yard work. And sure enough, as soon as I put the lawnmower away, my first thought every single time is, ooh, chicken nuggets, sweet and sour sauce, a Coke, and don't forget the fries. But classical conditioning isn't always a two-way street. What I mean by this is I certainly don't get the urge to come home and pull weeds if I do eat McDonald's first. If you take the time to explore your own eccentricities, I'm sure you will find instances of classical conditioning. Sometimes it's a small, insignificant, and maybe a little quirky thing. Sometimes it's much, much bigger. Understanding our own conditioning can help improve our lives. It can break a bad habit. Smokers are a great example. As a former smoker, this is something I can fully attest to. Before I was a smoker, I could eat a good meal, and after eating the meal, I was just content with the feeling of being full. But after I became a smoker, I realized that I enjoyed having a cigarette after eating a good meal. When it came time to quit smoking, this was one of the hardest things to overcome. I would do great all day and then have an amazing dinner. And as soon as I finished eating, the urge to smoke would rise up. It took months, if not years, to undo this conditioning that I had programmed within myself. And honestly, we never really fully undo all of it. There are still times today when I will have a really, really good meal and that voice will creep out from the dark parts of the back of my brain saying, "Ooh, cigarette'd be good." Thankfully, I spend more time pondering why I had that thought than wondering if I should go buy a pack and start smoking again. This is the basis for psychological addiction. While we don't need the physiological effects of the addiction, we have conditioned ourselves to expect it at certain times. Let's take a look at that psychological addiction for a few minutes. Nicotine is obviously an addictive chemical, and not just on a psychological level, but a physical one as well. While the physical side is actually relatively easy to overcome when you compare it to a larger addiction like opioids, why do so many people struggle with quitting smoking? It's the psychological addiction. The psychological addiction makes it so much harder to overcome. This is something I've gone through myself, as I've said, and it didn't take me long to notice that the major cravings I would have would come at certain times, during certain situations. I would be managing just fine, and then I'd get in the car to drive somewhere, and the craving would hit me really hard. Why? Because for so many years, each time I got into the car, I would start the engine, light up a cigarette. On a long drive, if I started to feel tired, I would crack open the window and light one up. So when it came time to quitting, driving was another really difficult challenge for me. The cravings would be enormous, and the longer the drive, the stronger the cravings got. I had conditioned myself to smoke while driving, and now I was trying to drive without it and found that it was all I could think about. And driving wasn't the only time I was having issues. A big, really delicious meal, craving. Get really angry, craving. Get really stressed, craving. Hanging out with a friend, having a few beers, craving. The easiest way to break an addiction to something like smoking is to focus on other things. But when we have conditioned ourselves to feed our addictions during certain events in life that are fairly routine, it's really hard to think of anything else. The good news is that conditioning can be overwritten. In the experiment with Pavlov's dogs, for example, ringing the bell would cause the dogs to salivate. However, if the bell was repeatedly rung without the food being present, over time the dogs would stop salivating when the bell rang, because they no longer associated the bell with food. And we can apply this to ourselves. Those everyday situations that we conditioned ourselves into feeding our addictions can be reconditioned. The more you place yourself in those situations without feeding the addiction, the sooner the cravings will stop while in those situations. So now I can drive without ever thinking about a cigarette. I can have a good meal or a beer with a friend and not have even the most fleeting thought of a cigarette. There are still a few situations I encounter years after the last cigarette where a craving will sometimes come out of nowhere. Usually this is during one of those situations that I would feed the addiction in the past, but the situations happen so rarely that I haven't been able to fully condition myself out of the addiction. These cravings don't last long though, and again, it just leaves me wondering why the craving came up rather than whether I should go and start smoking again. There is, of course, a lot that goes into addictions besides just conditioning. So if you're ready to kick an addiction, it's critical to consult a doctor and possibly or probably even a mental health professional too. Some addictions just shouldn't be handled cold turkey, and if you have an addiction, whether it's alcohol, nicotine, or something stronger, please, please, please make that choice to break the addiction. Your friends and family will thank you for it in the long run, and even more importantly, you will thank yourself. And I'll thank you too, because hopefully you'll be around longer to dive into the world of psychology with me. So what are some other ways classical conditioning can impact us on a day-to-day basis? Well, there are a lot of ways, and not just can impact, but do impact. Many phobias are conditioned responses. All it takes is one bad experience with an animal or a situation, and the conditioning can be set. Maybe you used to be able to be in a room full of spiders and feel maybe a bit uncomfortable, but otherwise unfazed. Then watch a movie involving a spider biting someone, and suddenly the mere sight of a spider can send you into a panic. Another notable study that is worth mentioning here would be that of little Albert. Now, this is one that I had originally considered doing a full episode on by itself because it is such an interesting study, but I feel like it really fits well into this episode, and will likely be mentioned again relating to other topics. So the study was done in 1920 by John B. Watson and Rosalie Rayner. They wanted to test whether or not fear could be conditioned through classical conditioning. For their test subject, they selected a boy known only as Albert B., who was, at the start of the study, only 9 months old. They began with a baseline session. During this baseline session, Albert was introduced to a white rat, and the researchers observed that he had no fear response whatsoever to the rat. 2 months later, the researchers began the next set of sessions, the conditioning sessions. Little Albert was again introduced to the white rat, but this time, if Albert began to move toward or reach for the rat, the researchers would make a loud, frightening noise which startled Albert into crying. They did 2 sessions of this about a week apart. Then, around a week after the last conditioning session, they began the final session, where they tested Albert for generalized fear. They noted that when the rat was placed in the room with Albert, he would immediately shrink away from the rat, scream, and cry. They also noticed that anything with white fur would cause this fear response. Dogs, cats, rabbits, and even a fur coat. They had proven that they could introduce a neutral stimulus, and through a controlled stimulus, they could create a fear response to the neutral stimulus. After the study, Albert was discharged, and there really isn't much known about him after the study. The study itself, while it provided some valuable information and results, was extremely problematic, primarily for ethical reasons. Being less than a year old, Albert, of course, couldn't willingly consent to participate in the study. He was a completely unwitting participant. Albert's mother was not properly informed of what the study was, what they would be doing, and the potential results they were hoping for, so she couldn't give informed consent as a guardian, despite giving consent to allowing Albert to participate. And then there's the fact that these researchers had created a negative psychological state within a person, and they never worked to undo that conditioning or provide any kind of follow-up care. While Albert is almost certainly no longer living, as the study was done more than 100 years ago at this point, he likely spent much of his young life, and possibly all of his life, having some sort of fear reaction to anything with white fur. Such a study would be categorically rejected by any modern ethics review board for such unethical behavior. Now, I do need to make an important distinction here. There is one more form of conditioning. It's worth mentioning operant conditioning here. And while they are similar, they're not exactly the same. Where classical conditioning associates an involuntary response to an unrelated event, operant condition is much more direct. An example of operant conditioning would be the old Book It program. The older listeners out there will certainly remember Book It. For the younger listeners or anyone that was unfortunate enough to live in an area where it wasn't available, Book It was a partnership between public schools and Pizza Hut. Each time a student completed reading a certain number of books, I think it was something like 5 books, the teacher would give the student a certificate that the student could then take to Pizza Hut and redeem for a free personal pan pizza, essentially rewarding the good behavior of reading books with a desirable item, in this case, the pizza. And we do this all the time. How many times have you rewarded your kids for cleaning their room by taking them out to do something fun? Or given your dog a treat when they shake hands or sit? Using rewards to motivate certain behaviors is operant conditioning. Now you might be thinking, just as I was, that my earlier example with mowing the lawn and getting McDonald's was operant and not classical conditioning. But there is an important distinction. There was never a, if you mow the lawn and cut the weeds, I will go get McDonald's for lunch. I would just finish the yard work and find McDonald's waiting for me, or my mom would be on the way with it. It created an association between doing yard work and the taste of the food, rather than McDonald's being an advertised reward for doing the yard work. It probably seems obvious that parents can use conditioning to affect their kids' behaviors, but that's it, right? No one else is capable of using classical conditioning on us. Wrong. Very wrong, in fact. There is an entire industry built on using classical conditioning on us all the time. Very likely you've experienced this at least once today, potentially even during the course of this episode, and that's advertising. How exactly do advertisers use classical conditioning on us? I mean, it's a commercial. We can't smell the products. We can't taste them. We can't feel them. How can they possibly create a connection in our minds that checks the box for classical conditioning? It's all in what we see and hear. Have you ever noticed that certain commercials play certain kinds of music? Car ads will play something upbeat, usually a genre of music that appeals to the target audience for the ad. For example, rough and rugged truck ads have long used classic rock or country music to appeal to their target audience of outdoorsy or blue-collar workers, most often men. Music creates an emotional response, largely because music is a very emotional medium. When that emotional medium is overlaid on an advertisement for something that we want or that we may feel indifferent about, we slowly begin to associate that emotional feeling that the music creates with the product that's being advertised. And the hope is that you will start to want that emotional response all the time, and the best way to do that is to buy and use the product being sold. Visually, we see ads with attractive people flocking to or hanging around someone that has the product being sold. And we will all want that feeling of being desired, so eventually we will begin to associate that product with attracting the attractive people. Axe body spray, perfect example. Sports stadiums are filled with logos and advertisements for beer brands, and over time we begin to crave and eventually associate beer with watching sports. Politicians can use classical conditioning too during speeches. They will take their controversial take on a topic and associate it with something that we either really desire or we're really afraid of, and we begin to make the association between their idea and our emotional response. And while unverified as to whether or not it's actually true, people will use it on each other. So to start to wrap this up, I'll put up another fun example, which is albeit largely unverified and could potentially be completely fake, but it is a great example of how this could potentially be used in a normal day-to-day life. So there was a social media post that I saw online where a woman was claiming that when she was in school, she had a huge crush on this guy. The guy barely knew that she existed and just wasn't into her at all. One day she discovered what his favorite type of candy was, and from that day forward, according to her, every time she would see him, she would offer him a piece of this candy, knowing that it was his favorite. Eventually, again, according to her, he would see her from a distance and suddenly his eyes would light up and he would be excited to see her. And then, of course, his face would dissolve into confusion as to why he was so excited to see her when previously he had no interest in her whatsoever. Largely, this could be a bunch of crap, as I said, and just a funny story someone made up, but it does explain classical conditioning rather well. And I think it's a great example, as I said, of how we can be conditioned by virtually anyone, anytime. So classical conditioning, is it a good thing or a bad thing? I mean, having our behavior altered by forming an association with something completely unrelated might seem a bit shady, and I would agree with you there. But it's not always a bad thing. Classical conditioning happens to us naturally to keep us safe, to keep us healthy, to keep us motivated and curious. It can help us learn good behaviors and healthy approaches to life, but it can also be misused. It can lead us to buy something that we really don't want, eat something that our diets tell us we probably shouldn't, and spend money that we just can't afford to spend. It can be used to steer us in one political direction or another without us feeling the need to fully examine in depth the true nature of the political direction we're starting to move. It's important to understand what classical conditioning is and how it affects you. This can really help you understand some of the choices you make and possibly help you avoid the trap of buying things you don't need because you've been conditioned to have that kind of response. Should you use classical conditioning to manipulate someone into reacting a certain way for you? Probably, well, most definitely not. Manipulation never leads to anything healthy. But in the right circumstances, classical conditioning can be useful and beneficial. The intro music for this podcast will, hopefully, over time, make you feel excited to learn about the massive world of psychology. Get your brain juices stirring, your neurons firing, and in anticipation of learning something new. Are you still feeling like the sound of a bell causing dogs to salivate seems a bit out there? Well, let's try a little experiment of our own. So, did you just think about tacos? If you did, congratulations. You have been conditioned. Hopefully, at least a few people out there have enjoyed this topic and have learned something, and will be just curious enough to come back for more. This week, we delved into classical conditioning. In future episodes, we will explore more classical studies and experiments, understanding why people are so easily led into believing a lie. We will dive into the power of prayer and how psychology interacts with prayer. We may even dive into the somewhat seedy but really fascinating world of psychology and sex. Next week, we'll look at one of the most intriguing psychological experiments ever conducted, Stanley Milgram's obedience study. A study aimed to learn why people are so seemingly eager to do things that anyone in their right mind would never, ever do. Like why so many Germans followed Hitler and the Nazi Party during World War II and committed atrocities that seem like things no rational person would ever do. Why so many people that get in trouble often say, "But I was just following orders." I hope you've enjoyed this week's episode, and I hope to see you all back here next week. And hey, bring a friend. Don't forget to leave a review on whichever platform you are listening from, as it really helps the show grow. Thank you for listening today. I'm John Shaw, and remember, understanding your mind is the first step to changing your life. Until next time, be kind to yourself.